beat the waiver wire with these 10 mustache players heading into week 12 fantasy football. We want to help you guys get these guys before they become high priority waiver wire adds. Last week we talked about Emmanuel Wilson, and if you didn't get a chance to add Emmanuel Wilson, then make sure you tune into this video. We started off with player number 1 that I'd be stashing, and these are going to be based on how I would add them in my priority. Number 1 would be Luther Burden of the Chicago Bears. And Luther Burden, to me, is on a very similar trajectory as what we saw Amon-Ra St. Brown from a few years ago in his rookie level season, where essentially the whole season doesn't really do much, and then all of a sudden starts to show signs of life, starts to kind of become wide receiver 3, become wide receiver 2 on the depth chart, and then we see a snap share, and not only then we see his production increase in the fantasy football playoffs. I think we could be right along the same lines here with Luther Burden, as we're talking about a guy who, since their bye week, has continued to increase the snap share after the injury where he missed week 9 versus Cincinnati. In week 10 and week 11, he's had a 49 and a 44% overall snap share, and he has clearly become the wide receiver 3. He has passed Zacchaeus on the depth chart. And now I understand passing Zacchaeus is great, but you still got DJ Moore, you still got Rome Odunze, you still got Colson Loveland to contend with targets, as well as like DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. So I understand why you might be a little bit hesitant of adding Luther Burden, but we have seen a multitude of wide receiver injuries. We've seen some great guys kind of appear. Michael Wilson off the waiver wire, but how long is that actually going to last? I think if Luther Burden is a guy who has long-term potential to be a guy that could end up being a top 24 wide receiver for us down the stretch. So I definitely want to be taking a shot on Luther Burden. He's only 20% rostered in sleeper leagues. What happens if they kind of start to see, is Luther Burden our number 2 wide receiver? Like, what if he is the number 2 next to Rome Odunze instead of DJ Moore? I think there's a lot of potential there. So you definitely want to make sure that you are stashing some Luther Burden. We move on to my stash number 2. And it's going to be Devin Neal for the New Orleans Saints. And as we kind of get into these next stashes, a lot of these guys are going to be running back handcuffs. But sometimes I do like having the handcuff if one of my elite level running backs is something were to happen. But if you own a handcuff of one of your league mates, really good running backs, all of a sudden you might just stumble your way. Like if you had Emmanuel Wilson this week and you didn't have Josh Jacobs, you might stumble your way into a top 15, top 17 level production. Now, I am recording this on Thursday. This is coming out on Saturday. So there's a chance that maybe Josh Jacobs playing, and maybe that's a bad example. But anyway, Devin Neal for the Saints, his matchups coming down the stretch. When we're talking like the fantasy football playoffs, week 16 versus the Jets, week 17 versus Tennessee, week 15 versus Carolina, those are absolutely juicy. And we're looking at him coming into week 12 and week 13 versus Atlanta and Miami. Alvin Kamara's getting up there in age. I'm not saying that they're just going to, go willy-nilly, but I think Devin Neal, who's had a 39 and 35% snap share, 46% snap share over the last 3 weeks, he's very much so involved in this offense. Now, 4, 2, 6 fantasy points. I understand it's not great, but based on these matchups coming up, you might want a piece of this backfield, and it could honestly, Devin Neal could overtake, and I'm not saying overtake Alvin Kamara. Like Alvin Kamara is very talented, but he is getting up there in age. All it takes is one Alvin Kamara injury for Devin Neal to be super, super relevant. So you definitely want to have Devin Neal. I like the matchups, especially in the fantasy football playoffs, and I think he could provide some more like high-end flex appeal upside, even as he continues to take more and more of this overall backfield. Now we move on to stash number 3, and it's going to be Blake Corum for the Rams. And Blake Corum right now is 22% rostered in sleeper leagues, and I am with anybody that would say the last 2 weeks, 5.6, 1.5 fantasy points. He's had a 39 and a 31% snap share. I think we can clearly see that Kyren Williams is more explosive than Blake Corum. As somebody that owns a ton of Kyren Williams, yes, does it upset me when I see it's the Blake Corum drive and Blake Corum comes out there and there's no Kyren Williams? Yes, but they continue to want to get him more opportunities because they did draft him with a 3rd-round pick last year in the 2024 NFL draft. And so for me, I do want to kind of continue to stash Blake Corum because down the stretch, week 14 Arizona, week 15 Detroit, week 16 Seattle, week 17 Atlanta, like if he were to get like a start, like, if something were to happen, and knock on wood, I have plenty of Kyren Williams, so I'm not trying to jinx myself, but there are some good matchups for this Rams team, and especially as they are potentially going for the Super Bowl run, do they like continue to kind of push up and keep his snap share right around 35 to 40% to keep Kyren Williams super, super healthy? I think that's something that could be interesting. So I do think Blake Corum holds a lot of appeal, especially if you are in that little stash category and needing some help at the running back position. Now, my 4th overall stash, it's going to be Brian Robinson for the 49ers. And we've seen Brian Robinson get a little bit more involved. 11.3 fantasy points in week 9. in week 10, 11.5 fantasy points, and only had 2.4 versus Atlanta. But he is 36% rostered, so he's a little bit more rostered of a player than some other stashes that we might be talking about in this video. But week 12 versus Carolina, week 13 versus Cleveland, they go on bye in week 14, week 15 versus Tennessee, that's a juicy matchup, week 16 versus Indianapolis. Like, yes, are all these great matchups for CMC? 100%. But have we seen CMC remain healthy through a full season? Still no. If you own CMC, you got to be kind of like, man, it's great, but you're also a little bit worried of like, you're seeing all these other injuries from guys, and we're like, why is nothing happening to Christian McCaffrey? Now, I'm not wishing that on Christian McCaffrey. I also own 0 share, so I apologize if this is becoming a own this guy because his starting running back is going to get injured. But this is the point of the season where we need advantages. And if we can get an advantage by having a guy that could instantly, if Brian Robinson were to start a game, he'd be a top 20 running back. And so you just want to take that in consideration when you're picking up some of these guys. The next stash, it's going to be Tank Bigsby for the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, Tank Bigsby has shown really great life. In week 8 versus the Giants, had 10.4 fantasy points. In week 11 versus Detroit, had 4 carries for 34 yards for 8.5 yards per carry. Tank Bigsby, let's not forget this offseason, there was talk that Tank Bigsby was going to overtake Travis Etienne and be the clear back that you want to own for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, that did not necessarily happen. Tank Bigsby gets traded away to the Philadelphia Eagles, and we've seen the Philadelphia Eagles with Saquon Barkley be kind of meh this season in the running game. But I do believe if something were to happen to Saquon Barkley, like this is actually like a true Brian Robinson, Tank Bigsby have 0-0 upside. Like they're not really getting on the field unless something were to happen to their starter. But it's an absolutely great offensive line. It's a great offensive situation for Tank Bigsby down the stretch. And that would be somebody that if you own Tank Bigsby and you didn't have to fight someone off the waiver wire or prioritize that, there's a chance that if something happens to Saquon, that guy would be a top 12 running back on the week. Now we move on to kind of my next guy that we're talking about. It's going to be Jayden Higgins for the Houston Texans. And we got CJ Stroud coming back over the next few weeks. But we're seeing Jayden Higgins continue to kind of ascend this overall depth chart for the Houston Texans. He's 23% rostered in sleeper leagues, 9.5 fantasy points versus Tennessee, 15.2 fantasy points versus Jacksonville in full PPR. We got Buffalo, which is happening on Thursday night. So I realize I'm saying this, and he will have already played by the time that you guys are looking to pick up. It's okay, because I'm still wanting to talk about Jayden Higgins. Whatever he does, go pick him up. He might be the most priority waiver wire ad on, for week going into Thanksgiving week. But going forward, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Arizona, Vegas, Chargers. These are some really great matchups. So like I said, you can't pick it up now because I'm just realizing this as I made my list. But definitely go check out Jayden Higgins. You need to mention it, that if you need wide receiver help, because I haven't mentioned any wide receivers up to this point, definitely go check out some Jayden Higgins. Now we move on to Jalen Coker, and he is my next mustache wide receiver here. And like I said, I prioritize those running backs ahead because there's just a little bit more clear way for them to show potential. But we saw Bryce Young in week 11 look like prime Brett Favre. Helps Jalen Coker and Ted McMillan both have really good fantasy days. 11.2 fantasy points for Jalen Coker with a 68% snap share, 4 targets, 4 receptions for 52 yards. This was a season high for Jalen Coker, and he looked good. And Jalen Coker is just like a big slot, 6'3", 213. And, of course, earlier on in the season, I was hyping up, hey, stash him, stash him, stash him. Well, we have seen zero signs of life until this Week 11 game. But coming down the stretch here, we're looking at matchups versus San Francisco this week, versus the Rams. They then go on bye, versus New Orleans, versus Tampa Bay, versus Seattle. Like, there are matchups where this Carolina Panthers team is going to have to throw the ball far and wide to even stay in the game. So definitely get some Jalen Coker. I think he's very valuable for you as a stash. Now, my next and final kind of player stash before we talk about some defenses to look forward to in the coming weeks, it's going to be Mason Taylor for the Jets. He's 22% rostered. Tyrod Taylor being promoted to quarterback. Yes, is it sad for Justin Fields? You see the jerseys behind me. I'm a Buckeye fan. We feel bad that Justin Fields hasn't figured out how to not be a running back in the NFL. That's okay. We saw Mason Taylor post a 4-catch night in week 11, put up 7 fantasy points. But if he continues to hover in the 75 to 85% snap share type tight end, they need weapons. They need to pass the ball. Garrett Wilson's looking like he might just be out for a season at this point, at least for the next 3 to 4 weeks. We got, they trade for A.D. Mitchell. We got John Mechie. But can we make the argument here that maybe Mason Taylor, especially with Tyrod Taylor playing quarterback, could provide a ton of upside? He might be the best pass catcher that the Jets have at this point. Give me Mason Taylor as a guy that has high-end upside if you need some tight end help. You don't have a Trey McBride. You don't have a Brock Bowers. Now we kind of move it into the defensive matchups here to look forward to. And I think a lot of you already have your defenses kind of aligned. But if we're talking about defenses that you are wanting to stash, the first one would be the Atlanta Falcons. And they just got off, getting absolutely beat down in this Week 11 matchup. They only put up 4 fantasy points after putting up 12 and 14 versus New England and Indianapolis the weeks before. But going forward, they're playing against New Orleans. So this is like a decent matchup. So they're available in every one out of every 2 leagues. Then they're going up against the Jets. This could be, you for sure want to play them against the Jets. So that's why I kind of have them as a must-stash defense. But if you wanted to play them this week versus New Orleans, they weren't super high in my defensive rankings this week just because we have seen a lot of inconsistency. Honestly, they've been giving up a ton of points, a ton of touchdowns, but they have been getting sacks. And so that's the way that when we're looking at the Atlanta Falcons, it has been pretty good there. So Atlanta Falcons would be my number 1 mustache defense heading into Week 13. But the next defense is going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars, who this week are going up against Arizona. That is juicy. We've seen Jacoby Brissett be able to throw the ball all over the yard, though, so it's maybe not the best matchup. But in Week 13, they're going up against Tennessee, and we want to target any of these defenses going up against Tennessee. So I think Jacksonville, they're only 35% rostered. They, depending on who you have, if you don't have one of the top 3 or 4 defenses this week, I would maybe look to pivot to Jacksonville because I do think you can get like a 2-week run out of the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. But if you like fantasy football, if you like winning, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button as we are on the way to 3,000 subscribers here on the 4for4 Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I'm answering every start sit question down below, so make sure you ask those questions, and we will be back next week as it's Thanksgiving week to still provide you all the great analysis that we can. Appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.